A couple of years ago, I had the great privilege to be invited to collaborate with three amazing artists in a performance piece entitled Submission in 5 Acts. I'd like to share a clip of that piece with you now. My collaborators were visual and performance artist Indira Allegra, artist and cultural worker Toshie Cargill, and composer Amadeus Regucera. It was part of a 3-day experimental performing arts festival, but tell me what it feels like. The erotic practice of liberation, curated by Cargill and presented by the SOMArts Cultural Center in San Francisco. To quote briefly from the program notes, Submission in 5 Acts enlists the skill of a weaver, an artist alert to the presence of tension as creative material, to shape the tension between these performers, resulting in a transformation of patriarchal and colonial tensions in orchestral music and relationships through a radical reimagining of classical space and power exchange between conductor, player, and composer. This performance piece was a huge milestone for me in my personal journey of decolonization, and I learned firsthand that it's not just an end goal. It is a collective process in which every individual examines their beliefs and preferences and puts them in the context of history and society as a whole. It is also a process by which the colonized can achieve agency. By engaging with this process, cultural hierarchies can be critically examined, restructured or dismantled, and ultimately made more equitable. This can be done in every sector of society, but let's look at music. As a society, we assign values to different genres of music through consumption and funding. There is a divide and a hierarchy between what music is valued as art and what is just entertainment. In the US, Western European classical music is afforded a place of prestige over music of other ethnicities and commercial music. These assigned social values are reflected in our personal preferences. I can use myself as an example in this regard. In the years before Submission in 5 Acts, I had begun to question why I held classical music in such esteem. I had always been attracted to classical music, and the orchestra played a huge role in my life since I began playing the violin in my public elementary school. I loved the experience of creating something with others, and I believed that through classical music, one could access deeper emotions than what you usually get to experience in the everyday. The classical music world has a habit of lamenting its impending doom, and I believed I was doing my part in keeping this high art from dying. I dutifully studied my scores and venerated the composers. Ultimately, I decided I wanted to dedicate my career to classical music and become a conductor. Conducting is a highly male, highly white-dominated occupation, and I've received my share of microaggressions as a woman or a minority. Greatest hits among these being Chinese-looking people playing German music and Hey Token Girl. But I kept reminding myself that my presence is valid and that I would continue to fight for representation in this elite music world. But I began to question what message I was perpetuating by focusing solely on the canonized pieces. Was I really fighting for equal perception of women and minorities in a field where we are underrepresented? Or had I been culturally colonized, and was I trying to attain white maleness and perpetuate the superiority of European culture? How did I, as a person of Filipino descent, conceptualize a place for myself in the European art music world? As a point of entry, I considered the words often used to describe classical music and its composers, such as universal, timeless, or genius. In fact, when flipping through brochures of orchestras, it'd be easy to conclude that the realm of genius is completely the dominion of dead European men. How could it be that this specific music was universal and others weren't? I turned to history, and as I dug, I realized I didn't come to these beliefs and values completely on my own. They reflected the persistent colonialist structure of American society. In a very brief walk through the institutionalization of classical music and the formation of the classical canon in the United States, beginning in the late 19th century, we can see how European art forms were normalized and ethnic or world musics were localized and devalued. I came to see Western European art music in a different light, as an ethnic music with a very enthusiastic PR team. Theodore Thomas, the first conductor of the Chicago Symphony and commonly referred to as the father of the American Symphony Orchestra, often opined that symphonic music is the highest flower of art, and the symphony orchestra shows the culture of a community, not opera. To put that into context, opera and Shakespeare were popular forms of entertainment at that time. Educated, wealthy urban elites mirrored that musical worldview. They made concerted efforts to distinguish themselves in society, establishing institutions through which they could elevate their preferred European arts to the level of universal, above the popular and commercial. For example, let's look at the Boston Brahmins. According to sociologist Paul DiMaggio, they were a self-titled class who drew their name from the high-order Hindu caste. They were responsible for the creation of the Boston Symphony Orchestra and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. They sought to create cultural boundaries and establish hegemony over an influx of immigrants who constituted the lower classes. They instituted charitable nonprofit organizations to house culture under the guise of serving the whole community while catering mainly to the elite. They could then centralize the performance of high art in these organizations and maintain control of their governance boards. By doing all this, they were able to socially distinguish themselves and equated European arts with high culture. In conjunction, European classical music was sacralized and the composers deified in American high culture. Music critic John Sullivan Dwight was highly influential in this endeavor. He often used religious language to describe instrumental European music and its composers. He used words such as holy, soul, prayer, and blessed. This sentiment was absorbed and echoed across the country. The Philharmonic Society of New York wrote, "It must be acknowledged that the science of music as it exists in nature is not of human invention, but divine appointment." Musics that could be seen as indigenous to the United States, such as that of African Americans and American Indians, were devalued and dehumanized. This was also extended to works by white composers who drew on themes from these other musical traditions. For example, Dvorak's New World Symphony and Edward MacDowell's Indian Suite. Critic William Apthorpe dismissed both of these as futile attempts to make civilized music by civilized methods out of essentially barbaric material, resulting in a mere apotheosis of ugliness, distorted forms, and barbarous expression. So there it is in the very smallest of nutshells. The symphony orchestra and European music became synonymous with culture, centralized into concert halls under the control of an elite social class in order to dominate lower classes, and sacralized, solidifying its place as highbrow art in American society. A look at orchestral demographics today makes it clear that they have not been able to shake their European colonialist roots. An industry study showed that in 2014, American orchestras were still overwhelmingly white, with whites constituting over 85% of the instrumentalist population. That same year, a study by the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra found that 60% of all works programmed were written by German, Austrian, Russian, and French composers. The average year in which a work was composed remains solidly locked in the 1880s. Recently, however, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, many ensembles have issued commitment to diversity statements, and it will be interesting to see how this will manifest in action. But the work of decolonization cannot be done by the orchestras alone. In fact, it may be impossible to retroactively teach equity to a system designed to be inherently unequal. So, we need to work to change the system altogether, and there are steps that everyone can take to decolonize our musical hierarchies. First, consider your preferences and reflect on why they are what they are. You can use the exercise I did and think about the adjectives you would use to describe different genres and see if there are any trends in these words. Second, we need to diversify our investment in artists and artistic spaces, and that means financially, emotionally, and in performance. On an individual level, for example, take a moment to consider the culture you might choose to consume if you want to, say, have a special night out. Revel in what is unknown to you, and don't be afraid to not understand. Together, we can decentralize the concert hall as the keeper of culture, and all musics, those who create them and their spaces, can be appreciated and valued not just as ethnic novelty, but as art.